everybody. I'm Susan Howards, a Brookline criminal defense attorney, hosting the Safety Net temporarily while Steve Bressler is recuperating. The Safety Net is Brookline cable television station's local show, but it goes out everywhere, on domestic violence, offering resources, information, education, and if needed, help. We are so privileged today to have as our guest Raffi Freedman-Gurspan, and I'm going to let her take it from there. She is currently Deputy Director for the All on the Line campaign. Raffi, you're on.
Thank you so much for having me, Susan. So good to be with you, especially from being a Brookline native myself. I grew up there. I am adopted, though. I was adopted from Honduras, but grew up in the Coolidge Corner neighborhood. Went to the public schools there, so very much a hometown girl. But I now am in Washington, D.C., where I work at the National Redistricting Action Fund during my daytime job. But I have a background in transgender and human rights advocacy, and I know that today we're going to be talking about domestic violence from the standpoint of the transgender community. I have worked in nonprofit and government sectors for over a decade, and I'm also on the board of Time's Up, which is an organization that focuses on violence against women and sexual harassment and searching for gender equity in our policies and practices, both in the private sector and also in the public sector.
And what did you do for President Obama?
Right. I also worked at the White House between 2015 and 2017. I was President Obama's last LGBTQ liaison. I worked under Valerie Jarrett in her office, in the Office of Public Engagement.
Wow, you've done quite a bit for your young life. You're a busy woman, I can tell. So thanks for being with us. Domestic violence and partner assault are usually portrayed from a heterosexual gender, meaning non-transgender, where the abuser is typically a male, not always, and the survivor is typically a woman, not always. How does that framing impact the narratives for the LGBTQ community, especially transgender women, and especially from my perspective, transgender women of color?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your question. It's really actually a significant problem that domestic violence is portrayed in a very, what I would use the term heteronormative way of looking at the issue. Of course, not to discount the problem that exists, throughout, our communities, but for minority communities like the LGBTQ community, and specifically transgender people, the fact that we are not even considered half the time to be victims of domestic violence is a significant problem, not just on the face of it, but also from the way that access to services, the way that services are designed, are not designed with us in mind. One of the major issues for our community is talking about relationships. There still is significant stigma against people in general who enter into a relationship with a transgender person, in particular transgender women. We have found there is just more stigma, possibly because of just patriarchy and libel against homosexuality. Of course, there are distinctions here. But what happens is that when people enter into relationships that become toxic, whether because of stresses or actually because of prejudice and just hatred of transgender people, what we find is that transgender individuals have a very hard time getting out of those relationships. And in particular, even if they go to services or to counselors, they might not be understood. It might be just getting through the door and being understood as who they are as a transgender person. We like to say a lot of the times that in our community, pronouns are not necessarily just a passive thing for us, but it's actually a significant way of validating who we are. If the only counselor or services within a 10-mile radius is someone that is just unwilling to learn to work with a transgender individual or has significant prejudice, that could actually lead to a life or death situation for our community.
Are there any services that are specific to the transgender community where
Yes.
people are understanding, open, welcoming? And are these services nationwide?
Well, they're not nationwide. Luckily in Massachusetts, there's a group called the Network La Red. So they are a bilingual domestic violence protection organization that works with the LGBTQ community. And frankly, they are one of the nation's leaders when it comes to designing programs for LGBTQ folks in mind. And in particular, they have been on the front lines of work with the transgender community to really highlight the issue that for transgender people who are living in poverty, who are living in dire situations, and of course, those that unfortunately are leaving a domestic violence situation and might be on the street, accessing shelter is a massive, massive issue. And so I know the folks at the Network La Red have been really at the forefront of this issue, raising it, and have also been part of national discussions when designing standards. Thankfully, a lot of that work has translated in the last decade to progress both at state and federal levels, so that there are states now that have good guidance around inclusivity of the LGBTQ community. And then during the Obama administration, we were on a pathway to adopt national standards that kept the LGBTQ community in mind. Unfortunately, not all the work that we wanted to get done was done during our 8 years. But certainly I would say it was because of the advocates of people like the Network La Red that started the conversation decades ago that we're in the place that we're at. So it's not perfect, but we're much better than where we were.
Raffi, you mentioned that shelters were really difficult, I assume, to find and to be admitted to. Can you explain that a little bit? I mean, if somebody needs shelter, they need shelter, period.
Right. Well, one of the issues is that the shelters that do exist are divided by gender. So in many domestic violence shelters, understandably, they're women-only shelters, or less frequently, but men's-only shelters. For transgender people, especially those transgender people who are early in their transition, or I'm going to use a term known as non-binary, that means someone that doesn't necessarily identify with either male or femaleness, that becomes a stickier situation about truly where to house someone. What we always say is that an individual should be the one that determines where's the safest for them to live. For me as a transgender woman, for example, a safe place for me is at a women's shelter. Now, there are standards around having roommates or what the situation is. It might be more comfortable for actually the transgender person to be housed in like a single room. But what we have found is that unfortunately, half the time providers don't even want to have the conversation about what's in the best interest of the client. They don't want that client. Or in an egregious example I once heard is that at a shelter in Boston, they basically told the transgender person that she could sleep in the hallway, essentially between the two sides of the building where men and women were separated. And so obviously that was not a really comfortable nor frankly safe decision. We also know that in shelters, and more generally in homeless shelters in particular, it is very dangerous for transgender folks. And so part of it is just getting over stigma that's out there and trying to adopt better standards. Now, there are states, including there in Massachusetts, that now have gender identity as a protected status. So theoretically, a client can sue and say that that is discrimination. And thankfully, the state has adopted better standards. And basically that standard is what's in the best interest of the client. Where does the client feel the safest? And 90% of the time, we know where's the best place it is for us. But also, we should also be thinking about other situations that aren't necessarily shelters, about other safe houses, other support systems. But certainly, again, we are in a better place than where we were, but because we don't have nationwide protections at the federal level in particular, it makes it a patchwork situation where literally I'm protected in one state, but if I travel to another state, it's not guaranteed, especially if they don't have any LGBTQ protections, it's not guaranteed that I'm going to be treated the same way.
Raffi, are you careful about where you travel, given what you just informed us of? Are there certain states you avoid because you don't want any problems?
Well, in my work, Susan, alas, I have to travel the whole country. And in many ways, we should be able to do that, right? It is our country, and yes, there are different jurisdictions, but certainly we should be afforded the ability to go throughout this land. However, LGBTQ folks, in particular trans people, and I would argue really trans people of color who are dealing with both transphobia and also racism, certainly have a good Rolodex, if you will, of places that they've heard of that are safe. And we also know just from states that have passed non-discrimination laws where we actually are quote unquote protected. Certainly, we would argue that all people are protected under the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution.
Hopefully.
But what we see in practice is in states like Mississippi or in Arizona that have no statewide protections, that it's really around once the individual is in sort of a situation where they're encountering either government services or private services, and certainly the private services invoking that they are not required to protect, or that they will invoke a religious freedom argument to say that why they are discriminating. Right. Then what we're finding in state courts that don't have these protections is that individuals don't have recourse. So that's why we're trying to pass at the national level a bill called the Equality Act that would add gender identity and sexual orientation to our Civil Rights Act of 1964, so that throughout this country, there's no question that if you discriminate against someone who is LGBTQ, that is discrimination, that they do have a right to bring a case, and ultimately that we can start to change policies because it is a protected class. And we can think about, in the context of domestic violence and sexual assault, we are going to develop better standards and laws, even regulations that have us in mind.
Does the Mass Commission Against Discrimination allow for gender identity discrimination against trans?
Yeah, so they are one of the, as far as I'm aware, one of the earliest commissions that actually was doing great work when I was up there in Boston a decade ago, and really leading on this issue. And they have taken cases, I don't remember off the top of my head, but maybe it's around 3 pretty significant cases where they made rulings in favor of a transgender person. So yes, that Massachusetts, again, is certainly at the forefront. And of course, as you know, a few years ago, the voters up there resoundingly approved of a ballot initiative to protect transgender rights that had been passed in the last decade. So Massachusetts is certainly up there, but we have many states that have no protections. Nebraska, for example. Pennsylvania actually is a state, it's very surprising that people hear this, but Pennsylvania actually has no statewide protections. There are very significant good local laws in Pittsburgh and in Philadelphia and a handful of counties, but in statewide, Pennsylvania is one of those states where, yeah, I don't want to necessarily break down in the middle of Lord knows where. And then especially if I'm a survivor, if I'm someone that's trying to get somewhere, or I need to go to the only place that is open is a shelter in Pennsylvania, I'm taking a risk as an LGBTQ person by going there, but maybe that's the best place that I need to get away from the abuser.
Oh my goodness. Given the current situation in the world, meaning COVID-19, how has that affected the trans community? Number one, and have you seen an uptick in violence within the trans community? And the third part of my question is, has there been an uptick in violence from without the community fostered upon the community?
Yeah, to take the last one, we know anecdotally that it is becoming rougher out there for people who are already in dire straits. Transgender people face significant rates of housing instability, which can also be street homelessness. And that's actually nationwide, we know, for LGBTQ youth. that at least 40% of them that are on the streets are LGBTQ youth identified. So we know that this is a significantly vulnerable community. Of course, anytime there's stressors on society, it is the most vulnerable and stigmatized that usually bear the brunt, or at least the first wave of brunt. There have been significant attacks on transgender individuals, but that has also been, unfortunately, a constant throughout really the last decade. Now, part of the question I get a lot is, why is that happening? I think it's very much sort of tied to the sort of socioeconomic reality for many transgender folks. Many transgender folks make less than $10,000 a year, if you can believe that. And they are working some of those frontline jobs that right now folks are risking their lives to go to. And that might be nurses, but it's more likely folks that are working at fast food restaurants, or janitors, or are working as public transportation officials. What we know is that for transgender folks, that that stigma can translate into isolation, depression, and yes, where necessary, some people are engaging in survival work, especially if they've lost their job. Again, the most stigmatized usually bear the brunt. They're the ones that are kicked out the first. And we know with COVID that people are going to many different lengths to just survive. What I am very worried about as an advocate for the transgender community is that our community is going to be considered one of the last communities in this sort of moment where we're trying to help everyone. And in part, it's because I think there is still too much misunderstanding about who we are, but also there's bias. And unfortunately, when that is, when that's mixed in with racism, with misogyny, with just, you know, the situation where someone might be, you know, geographically, and what resources are there, I know that's hard. I particularly am thinking about friends of mine who are Native American, who are also transgender, and who have families and reservations right now, who are just going, as we hear through the news reports, are going through real hell out there. But to imagine that for folks who are in vulnerable situations themselves, that it must only be exacerbated.
But according to the news, there are a couple of reservations where they have taken matters, good for them, in their own hands. They've set up roadblocks.
Yes.
We're not letting you in unless you pass these, whatever they are, indicators that you are COVID-free. One case got in, they were trace it and track it, which are the code words now of let's solve this problem. They found the person and they got the person out, and they're going against the governor's wishes. And I have to hand it to them, because they're taking matters in their own to protect their people. But I'm concerned about, you happen to know, I know we didn't talk about this, what the rates of COVID are in the transgender community? Are they equal to the rest of the population? Higher, lower, none?
I don't believe we have that data, although I imagine that my colleagues who are in the LGBTQ, but really trans healthcare space, are probably trying to get their hands on that. One of the problems is just in reporting data in general, we don't always ask the question, what's your gender identity, or what was your sex assigned at birth? Although we are in certain places getting better. There are institutions like the Johns Hopkins medical centers that ask those questions, that put them on forms. But the reality is that the data is probably pretty skewed, and also, you know, about, we believe conservatively around 1% of the population identifies as transgender. But sometimes when, in terms of statistics, it could be insignificant. Of course, that we know they are not insignificant, but finding that data is hard. Now, we did lose a prominent transgender leader in the New York area, a Latina. And one of the issues that we have seen just with COVID in general is that minority communities are being impacted, in particular Black and Latina communities. And so I can only surmise that once we look at the data, once that is available, that, and certainly just also anecdotally from community reporting, which we shouldn't estimate is probably the best way for tracking trans community members who have unfortunately been lost, that we're going to see significant losses in the Black and brown communities of the trans community. Again, where people are living in dire straits, a lot of people are living in poverty, and a lot of people are also just trying to make ends meet by going to that job that is paying, you know, less than $15 a day, right? And then they're getting sick. So we don't have that data yet, but it would not, unfortunately, surprise me if the impact is pretty bad on our community.
Raffi, 2 more questions because we don't have much time. Tell us a little bit about Time's Up.
Yes.
And because I like the name. What does that mean, Time's Up? Is that like Me Too? Yeah,
well, we're different organizations, but similar movement around the issue of sexual assault, domestic violence, harassment at the workplace. Time's Up was formed a few years ago, famously at the Golden Globes, where women said on the stage that time is up, especially around the Harvey Weinstein case and other issues of sexual assault in the media industry. But then it morphed really into a broader women's rights organization that is focused on ending sexual assault, gender prejudice in the workplace, and really also working to empower women across the country. So I am fortunate enough to be on the board of that great organization. The foundation is our 501c3 side, where we're working with individuals and organizations to train them to both you know, speak on this issue, but also to look at their internal policies around sexual harassment in the workplace. And then Time's Up now is our advocacy 501c4 wing, where we are pushing for laws, you know, sort of cultural changes that we really want to see from, you know, a sort of political perspective when it comes to getting our lawmakers to change the laws and how we really do practice and reporting of this issue. And of course, what I'm very proud about is that Time's Up is very inclusive. We have a diverse board, but we also have a very thoughtful institution that thinks about communities like the transgender community, and thinking that we need to address this issue of violence against women for all women, including transgender women and non-binary people. So I'm very proud to be on that board and speaking on behalf of them to folks like you and getting our word out there. So you know, folks should check us up. It's timesup.org and then timesupnow.org. And folks should check out all of our resources on there for individuals, for employers, for employees, about the best practices when it comes to reporting and dealing with sexual assault and violence in the workplace.
Raffi, what advice would you give to young people who are trans? I know we have a trans community in Brookline, young people. I don't know if they have support in Brookline. I would hope they would, and I would assume they would because it's Brookline, but maybe.
Yeah, so I actually have met a couple of those individuals in the last few years. They have a very, we've always had a very robust LGBTQ community at the high school. We have one of the oldest gay straight alliances. I don't think it's called Gay Straight Alliance anymore, but when I was in high school there, we had a pretty supportive you know, community. And my words of advice to trans folks right now, especially young people, is number one, to remember that you're not alone, that there are many of us that are out there that are fighting for our dignity, for our rights, for our ability to just be and live our lives. I mean, one of the things that I want trans people to always remember is that they should remember to be happy. They should remember to embrace things that are beyond just their gender identity, that they need to be their complete selves. And one of that is that we just need to fight for the ability to be ourselves. I am very proud of the work that I have done over the past decade with so many just incredible leaders, both at the national level, but also on that local level. Just seeing trans people, we were very resilient and fighting for our rights, our communities, our families. And I have a lot of hope, but I also know it's very scary right now. So the other advice I have is that really do reach out to community groups, reach out to, you know, even me, I'm on Facebook. Folks should be, you know, feel free to send me a
Do you
direct
have
message.
Raffi, people could reach out to you too?
Yeah, absolutely. It happens a lot, and I'm happy to connect people with services. I mean, that's the point, is that so many people hold back, you know, to reach out for help, and especially if you are in a situation where you're experiencing, excuse me, abuse or violence or sexual assault or sexual harassment, which is absolutely just totally unacceptable. Don't use your trans identity as an excuse for not reaching out, or shame that there is a community. We are here, and we can help you.
Can you give an address where people could contact you, where you won't be overwhelmed?
Yeah. So the best would be to go to Facebook and search my name, Raffi, Raffi, and last name Freedman-Gurspan, Freedman -Gurspan, and that's the best way. I also have a LinkedIn if folks are on LinkedIn, and that's another way that people can find me.
Raffi, I can't thank you enough for sharing your experience, your knowledge, and your wealth of information on what to do and how to do it. Please stay well and safe during this COVID period, and I hope to see you soon here. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Susan.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.